This is CheloniaCast, episode 16. Thanks again for tuning in. This is sort of our fourth month of doing this and really overwhelmed with the support we've been getting. Everyone that's been tuning into the show. Definitely a lot of people reaching out and giving some great sort of feedback and questions, and seems like everyone's been enjoying it so far. So make sure you can find us at theturtleroom.org/CheloniaCast. We just recently set up the CheloniaCast Student Fund through the Turtle Room, where we're going to be raising money for student-led research in turtle and tortoise biology and conservation that will be picked by us in conjunction with the Turtle Room at the end of the year. So you can find us on there. Today we are really excited for this discussion we're going to have. We've got Dr. Stephen Platt from the Wildlife Conservation Society. He's their associate conservation biologist for Southeast Asia. Dr. Platt has done an incredible amount of work over many years working in Asia, but also pretty much all around the world, focusing on crocodilians and chelonians. He's also sort of the lead of some of the most successful, I think, arguably most successful reintroduction programs for an animal with the Star Tortoises and such, and we'll speak about that. But we're really excited to have you on, Dr. Platt. Thanks for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me on your show.
All right, so we started out with it's a pretty cliche question that we always start with, but what first got you interested in turtles / what made you decide to pursue the research / conservation route?
That's a good question. I didn't start out as a turtle biologist. I've always been interested in turtles ever since I was a little kid growing up in Louisiana. But I started out as a crocodilian biologist. I did my master's work on American alligators in southeast Louisiana, and then I did my PhD dissertation on Morlet's crocodile in Belize. Went back and worked later on American crocodile in Belize. So yeah, it was I kind of did a segue right after I finished my dissertation into turtles, which I'm interested in a lot of things, and it's just that's how things fell out, and I ended up in Southeast Asia where there are very few turtle biologists and lots of species of turtles, and so the more you start to work with something, the more more you realize how little is known and how little time we have to save these animals, and so I really that's kind of what got me focused on this field. I still really don't consider myself a turtle person. I'm more of a generalist than a specific, specifically confined to turtles. But turtles and crocodiles are pretty much what I do these days.
Right. So you said Southeast Asia, maybe like specifically, you've done a lot of work in Myanmar, but some of the other spots, like have you been sort of all over there, I imagine?
Yeah, I've done work in the first trip I took to Southeast Asia. I guess it was Southeast Asia. Yeah, to Indonesia. I went to Sulawesi and stumbled on the Sulawesi forest turtle, which had never been seen in the wild. Was known for market specimens. I didn't even know what I had in my hand at the time. I was so inexperienced. I had a copy of Ernst and Barr Bohr Turtles of the World, but that species was only described in the late 90s, and I couldn't find it in the book. Took a bunch of photographs. It was only later on that I realized what I'd found. And then, I've worked done crocodile work in Vietnam, Cambodia, worked with turtles and crocodiles there, Thailand, mostly crocodiles. Haven't done a lot of work there. Laos, where I am now, is mostly crocodile work. And then, but Myanmar is my that's kind of my second country. I used to live there for a number of years, spent a large portion of my time there. So that's where I've done the bulk of my work.
That's a great sort of segue, I guess, into what we'll sort of be focusing on, I guess, today, but we'll go all over the board. But so Myanmar is a really interesting place, and for pretty much my whole life, I've been interested in turtle. I think I speak for Ken and Jack too. It's been one of those places when you've got sort of, I guess, a global interest in turtles that immediately kind of comes up as a hotspot. It's right smack dab in the middle of the Indo-Burma hotspot for turtles, which I think has the most, like 20 endemic species and over 50 species just in this section of Southeast Asia. And so you're working in this really interesting area that we've all known of for a long time. But maybe you can provide a little background on why Myanmar is so interesting from the perspective of a turtle conservation biologist, and what sort of is there that other places don't necessarily have, or why should we be kind of keeping track of it, right?
Well, it's there. I think 24 species of turtles that are there in Myanmar, and 8 of them are either endemic species. One of them is considered a subspecies. It's probably a full species. So 8 of the 24 species that are found in Myanmar are endemic, and almost none. What we know about them, especially what we knew about them when I first got started in this game, is almost next to nothing. Our standard reference work was Malcolm Smith's the Turtles of British India and Burma, which was published in 1931. And I don't think Smith was particularly interested in turtles. He seemed to be more interested in snakes and lizards, just based on the papers and the books that he produced. And so, that book is there's a lot of descriptions of the animals, very little natural history information, and adding to the urgency or our interest in the area is that a lot of these species that are in Burma, especially these endemics, of the 8 of them, I think 7 are considered either threatened or endangered. So there's a time factor. Not only are there's lots of endemism there, but they're also, they're going pretty fast. And so there's an urgency to our work in Myanmar to save these turtles before they go extinct.
Right. Yeah. That seems to be the case. And bordering China and 4 or 5 other countries, right? That's got to be sort of a challenging thing when it comes to sort of porous borders and pouring over. Anyone that's sort of bordering China when it comes to turtles is going to get exploited, right? You've had the whale syndrome, sort of. China's depleted its own stocks, and now it's going to reach out into other places. But that sort of brings up an interesting question, right? The conservation sort of value of Myanmar when it comes to that, and the fact that it could be under threat from trade in other places that's kind of forcing it there. Maybe you've sort of worked on the turtle trade specifically. Maybe you can sort of provide some background too. You mentioned at least 7 species endangered or critically endangered. Maybe like, what are the factors, the reasons that that's occurring, and maybe if we know, where is it coming from the most out of those factors, right?
Yeah, it's different for each species. Some of it's habitat loss, like the roof turtle, which I assume we'll talk about later on. It's mostly was just collection of the eggs for people to eat. Just their long-term chronic collection, maybe over several hundred years, slowly just drove them to extinction. Star tortoises, of course, are incredibly valuable in the trade. And so they're the high-end international pet trade is what threatens them. So you really have to look at it as a species by species. Their threats particular to each species, but it all really boils down to the habitat loss and exploitation. Whether that exploitation is for commercial purposes or subsistence reasons, it's still turtles just can't sustain any type of exploitation. So those seem to be the primary drivers of the extinction of these turtles.
When it comes to sort of national regulation on this, how is Myanmar when it comes to like wildlife protection, I guess? Are these things illegal or harvest or?
Yeah, the laws are on the books. The problem is enforcing the laws. And until recently, there was almost no enforcement. When I first started, I never saw it. They don't let foreigners near the most border areas, but there were just, truckloads of turtles going across the border into China that were being traded. And it was all illegal, but nobody was bothering to enforce it. And, you know, probably, I mean, certainly things changed over 20 years, and the trade's been driven underground. But there's still, you know, it's worth, like star tortoises, people will take the risk because the payoff, the reward is so high. And you know, big-headed turtles are another one. And another thing about Myanmar, there are border areas that aren't really under government control, where a lot of things move across the border: human trafficking, narcotics, other types of wildlife. And so that's always been a problem, you know, been a problem with Myanmar.
Right. So the wildlife trade is sort of intermixed with other forms
Yeah,
of.
I don't like to call it trade. The trade implies, you know, it's a legal exchange of
Right.
goods for money.
Yeah.
I call it, you know, whenever we write about it, we refer to it as trafficking because it's, you know, it's illegal. And you know, these aren't, I think a common misconception with a lot of, you know, poaching, the people have this perception of poachers is just some poor guy out to feed his family, you know, or make a few dollars to buy some food. But that's often not the case. I mean, these are highly organized criminal gangs that are really, you know, making, you know, big money off of these, off of this activity. And so it's, you know, these are, they're not, it's a very depressing subject. I've worked on the trade, but it's not something I like to do, just because you know, it's extremely important, but it's just, you know, it's just really depressing to see all these animals being killed for no other reason than human greed.
I think it's an interesting point you bring up too, that it's not, in a lot of cases, it's not really just people going out. There's sort of a difference between subsistence harvest and when it comes to the actual trade that's going internationally, right? You've got gangs of people that are sort of acting as middlemen and maybe taking advantage of people that are kind of more remote and maybe don't have access to as much. But yeah, when it comes to the bulk of turtles moving, it's due to organized criminal groups that are doing this trafficking. I think that's the book by Edward and Don Mull on the conservation of river turtles and tortoises was pretty enlightening when it comes to like really thinking about the dynamics of trade. That was something that was kind of interesting reading through that. So any listeners out there looking for a good kind of overview of it, I'd suggest that, because they also bring up too in there. I think a lot of times maybe subsistence harvest is something that a lot of times is looked at as, okay, it's people living in harmony with nature, but in a lot of cases it could actually be pretty detrimental, right? Is that something, have you quantified how bad subsistence, like with all of this, it's hard, right, to get a metric because you don't even know really how much is occurring, how much trade is going on and such, because it's all sort of illegal, and it's not that you'd have to be everywhere all at once to get an idea for the quantities, right?
Yeah. We you know, getting information on trafficking in turtles is really difficult just because it's so much of it's, you know, a lot of it's an underground activity. So we look at seizures, and I think they're, you know, seriously, you know, we're probably missing, you know, the bulk of the animals that are going through. So the seizures are really just the tip of the iceberg. I think even like in the United States, but narcotic seizures, they estimate only about a quarter of what's coming into the United States actually gets interdicted. I think it's probably with wildlife, it's probably, especially in a place like Myanmar, it's probably a lot, you know, a lot less than a quarter that's actually intercepted.
I noticed with even in like currently a lot of Mexican turtles are in extremely high demand over in China, and every once in a while there'll be a confiscation of like 15,000 turtles or more. But just based on how they're packaged and shipped, and so many of those they just slip right through. They never get caught, and that's just really worrisome when you see the kind of numbers just in a single one. It's like, well, if this is a small percentage of what's going through, how dire is the situation for these animals in the wild? Like that's what it makes me think of.
Yeah, and you know, one thing about subsistence harvesting too, they rarely get the last animal. But when an animal is valuable, like a star tortoise, you know, people you know, it's worthwhile to spend time and hunt that last animal out. And so, yeah, you know, with these turtles, If they're in high demand, I think they'll just clean them out of the wild.
Yeah, that's a good point. The subsistence harvest too, I think, sort of a lot of times has sort of an intrinsic conservation value to it, to the people, right? They realize in a lot of cases that it's a expendable resource and limited, and that I'm just thinking about the Malaysian terrapins, right? That there was kind of a three, and the Perak River, that where I think the moles did their work. There was kind of three stages of nesting, and the way that they controlled the nesting there was the third kind of, I guess, large mass nesting of terrapins was protected, but the first two, they could actually consume the eggs and go out, and it was seemed to be strictly controlled sort of by the Sultanate, I guess, of Malaysia at that time, prior to World War II, before that all got destroyed. But I think there is sort of a lot of times this intrinsic, people realize they need to protect it. Whereas, yeah, like you said, that kind of backs up the idea that they're not going to really take the last one, but when there's a value to it, not in nature, removing it doesn't have any really impact on what traders care about.
Yeah, I mean, a subsistence harvest can be detrimental just because turtle populations can't sustain, very, very low harvest levels. I mean, commercialization of wildlife, especially turtles, is just that's going to spell the doom for almost any species.
Right. So yeah, that's interesting. And has there been any sort of measurable impacts on how COVID has impacted sort of the quantities of turtles moving in trade, or can we even really know?
No, it's impacted our ability to do work, but do field work. But as far as I know, it hasn't impacted, the smuggling of turtles or tortoises out of Southeast Asia. I mean, there were a lot of border closures that probably made things hard to move. But if there was an impact, it was very temporary.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that's interesting. Maybe we can briefly sort of change into a realm that a lot of freshwater and tortoise people don't necessarily venture into, but the sea turtle sort of area. I think that you've done a little work with that, but when it comes to Myanmar sea turtles, what is kind of the situation there?
It's pretty dire. I mean, compared to, there's actually a really good publication that was written by a British colonial fisheries officer, Maxwell. His first name escapes me at the moment, but he published this report in 1911. And there were just, he gave some pretty solid numbers on the turtles that were nesting along the coast at that time. And, compare that to what we have now, and it's just a fraction of the animals, a fraction of the population survives. And even areas that are monitored, we're still seeing a decline in sea turtle, in the number of nests there. So yeah, it's not a good situation. We've done some nest protection in some limited areas, but still a lot of the, you've got to protect the breeding females, and a lot of those animals are getting killed by shrimp trawls and long lines, things like that. So yeah, there's still sea turtles there, but how much longer they're going to last, it's hard to say.
And they nest predominantly on little like sandbanks, right, in the Irrawaddy. I'm probably butchering pronunciation, but the Irrawaddy Delta, these little islands of sand, right?
There's one island off in the Diamond Island, where there's quite a bit of green turtle nesting, and that's not really at the mouth of the river. But there are some nesting areas at the mouth of the Irrawaddy River, but they're not. The number of turtles there continues to decline. I mean, I went there and first went there in 1999. I can't quote the numbers offhand. And I went back in 2017, and the number of nests I saw the second time, 17, 18 years later, was just, were very few. Whereas in 1999, there were, pretty much nests all over the place. And those were mostly Ridley's, olive ridleys in that were nesting there.
Interesting. That's interesting historically that we've got information from Maxwell. I know he reported some of the river terrapins as well, but we'll get into that. Yeah, so I guess we could sort of, like, a lot of people might know the work that WCS and the Turtle Survival Alliance do with the Burmese roof turtles, star tortoises, and such, and we'll certainly talk about that. But maybe we could just kind of go into some of the species that are not as well covered, I guess, by the media and such, maybe kind of less charismatic, and that might be the reason. And obviously, maybe in less of a precarious situation than some of the other species. But so kind of, I mean, maybe just walk us through how diverse when it comes to the genera that you have in Myanmar, how diverse the turtles are, and kind of what we know. I think a lot of the work, right, has been just on documenting ranges for species, because as you said, that your reference for this was from the 30s, right? So there's very little to go off of. So just establishing kind of baselines. What kind of species do we have in total in Myanmar, and what do we know about them and in terms of their range and such?
Well, we've got 24 species. We've got a pretty good handle on their ranges, but we don't know much about them. I mean, even the ones we've been working with, there's still big gaps in our knowledge as far as what we know. I mean, basically anything we learn is new information, because there was just, they were just, Smith did his work, then World War II came around, the British left, military government took over in Burma. There was civil unrest after World War II. And then from 1962 on, research by foreigners and also by Myanmar academics was discouraged. So, and turtles have never been a high priority really for anyone. So yeah, pretty much, we don't know. We know about where they're found, but that's about it. And there, we're still range extensions that we come across every now and then. But as far as the 24 species, I personally think that 23 of them are threatened, to various degrees of severity. The only one that seems to do relatively well is the little flap shell Lissamy scutata, which is you could even find them in ditches in Yangon. They just seem to, I think they mature very quickly, and they lay a good number of eggs for such a small turtle. And they have fairly good survival. And probably also, I should say, the Indian flap shell as well, which is found in extreme western Myanmar. They have yellow spots on the shell, and a lot of people think that they can contract skin diseases from eating them. So, they leave them alone. They have a limited distribution in Myanmar, but they seem to be doing pretty good. The other flap shell is found pretty much throughout central Myanmar, southern Myanmar, and they seem to be, like I say, they seem to be doing fairly well. Everybody else is probably is probably threatened to some extent.
Interesting. The soft shells are real interesting in that region in general, right? You've got such a diversity of pretty much form, morphology, size, everything. But maybe you could talk a little bit about, you've got the Nielsonia and the Ketra there. I know Jax really loves Ketra. So you could...
Curious about like what is even really known about the Ketra, like vandyke, just within their natural range in general, and do they seem to get as large as some of the other members of their genus, and what kind of conservation status are they in, if we even really fully know that?
Yeah, we don't know what their status is. They are exploited. When we did our review of turtle trafficking in Myanmar, we didn't get many soft shells, but I think those are probably, a lot of those are not being exported because they're difficult to get out of the country alive. So people just eat them, there. So we never see them really in the traffic statistics. But they can, I've never seen a really large one except on the biggest ones I've ever seen were in a aquaculture facility in Thailand. But they can get quite large. We did a little, we fortuitously stumbled on some nests, and we've incubated some eggs and then released the hatchlings on the Chinuan River. And there are some up, you just don't have I just don't feel confident in saying that there's a secure population there. They are in the Chinuan, in the upper Chinuan, and we've tried to get an assurance colony established, but we didn't have very good luck. And we just need, we're kind of overstretched as it is with what we're doing, and we just weren't able to branch off into soft shells. But the Nielsonian and the Chitra vandyke it would behoove us to establish assurance colonies. We just, haven't had the resources to do so. They're an interesting turtle, though, because at least from a reproductive standpoint, because all the other river turtles kind of follow the same pattern where they nest in the dry season when the water levels are low and the sandbanks are exposed. And that's what we always assumed that the Chitra would do. But the nests we found were at the height of the wet season. And they seem like, at that time, those sandbanks are underwater, or only the very tops are exposed, and they were nesting right at the crest of the sandbanks. And so they're taking a risk, but the eggs hatch out in the wet season, towards the end of the wet season. And I'm sure, nests are lost due to flooding on a regular basis. But that was really kind of a neat, we have very small sample size, so they may nest, over a much longer period. But that was kind of a neat exception to the general rule that we found in that species.
And something. Oh, go ahead, Ray.
I've always had this question: is how do you even go about capturing like Keitra, or the Nielsonia I could see, but how would you catch them in the wild compared to we use hoop net traps all over the United States here for a lot of species of turtles. Does that even work for would that even work on those soft shells, or do you have to use some sort of net or just
Well, the fishermen catch them on hooks. If baited hooks. We've never actually gone out and tried to catch any soft shells. But if I was going to do it, I'd use gill nets and just check them, be right there. I think they would get entangled. The thing about trapping turtles in Asia is you want to be careful. I feel hook nets would work just fine, but people don't use them. And so if I show up with a bunch of hook nets and start catching turtles, and people go, "Whoa, that's a pretty good way to catch turtles. I got to go out and get some hook nets," And so you have to be careful about doing that. But also, turtles are usually at really low densities, and so trapping, it would work probably, but it would take a lot of trap effort to actually catch enough turtles to do a study on, say. So a lot of the stuff we get is just kind of opportunistic. Somebody will have a turtle and we hear about it, we go examine it, or we'll stumble on one when we're out in the field. The turtle nest we found, our boatman found, he just happened to be passing down the river and saw the tracks going up onto the top of the sandbank. So that's now the Batagear, the Batagear trivitata, we know where they nest, so we watch those sandbanks. But yeah, it's doing turtle work in Myanmar is very different than than doing similar work in the United States.
I guess one of the most predominant species in Myanmar would be the invasive red-eared sliders. Do those seem to be leading to the decline of the native species, or do they seem to be occupying different niches?
No, they're very common. In fact, our biggest seizure of turtles were over almost 3,000 red-eared slider hatchlings. We had to take those out because it dwarfs all the other. It really screws up the statistics. But no, they're very common in pagoda ponds, but even natural ponds around Yangon, for instance, you'll see them. But I've never managed to find them in the wild outside of those are natural ponds, and I've never seen any reproducing red-eared sliders. And so, red-eared sliders are not a tropical species. They're, right. Temperate, United States. And I'm not really convinced that they're established. People, they keep dumping all these hatchlings around. And also, like in Yangon, they're just literally hundreds of thousands of house crows. And so the staff at the Yangon Zoo, they have a big pond there. It's a natural lake. And they told me about seeing trachemes come out to nest, and they'll nest, and a house crow immediately lands behind them and just picks the eggs off as they're laid. And these are social birds. And so, when one house crow's eating its fill of eggs, another one comes and takes its place. And I think in a lot of these ponds, there are naturally these snakeheads. Chana is the genus. They're native to Southeast Asia, and they probably eat the hatchling. So I'm not aware of any place that trachemes has actually become established in the wild, and if they did, whether or not they were threatened, the native species it's an open question right now. We just don't know. But I don't recommend anybody releasing trachemes outside of their natural range. But I've not seen anything in Southeast Asia to indicate that they're threatening. That they would threaten, turtles. There's not really any offhand. I can't think of any turtle that really is in the same niche as or what I would define as a niche of Trachemes scripta, that in Southeast Asia. So it's not a major. I don't consider it a major threat to turtle populations in Southeast Asia.
Right.
It's an interesting. So I've spent a few years working on a project where we did a lot of empirical work, based on observations in Southern California, looking at how Western pond turtles and red-eared sliders bask, and looking at kind of the distribution of where they're using aerial basking sites. And it seems like there is sort of a difference in how they use them, but I think that it's hard to say, exactly what kind of effects that they would have. And I think a lot of the reasons that there's not a lot of factually or empirically based data to say that there is any effect, right? Looking at it from the niche perspective is the right way to do it. When I hear people say, "Oh, they're more aggressive, they reproduce more, they're bigger," I mean, those are sort of facts about sliders, but that doesn't prove anything that they have an impact on turtles that might have a slightly different niche or very different niche. They're not really going to be overlapping. I'm working on hopefully by the time TSA rolls around, I'll have a lot of it done, but working on some, because we couldn't really prove an interaction effect between sliders and pond turtles just based on the observational data. So now I'm doing some work with these. You can sort of parameterize these differential equations and looking at theoretical over time. How are the sliders and pond turtles, the niches kind of expanding and contracting with respect to the others? So that should be something kind of interesting, but it's like there's not really any other work that's been done in that sector. So it's interesting to hear in Southeast Asia that I guess it sort of makes sense, right? There's not going to be a huge sort of urge to import them when you already have so many turtles. The trade is going to be based on that more.
Yeah, they import, probably hundreds of thousands of them. And what they do, at least in Myanmar, if you go to the pagodas, Buddhists believe that you can gain merit if you take an animal, a fish or a bird, a turtle, and release it. And so they usually have these big ponds on the grounds of pagoda, and they'll buy hatchlings sliders and release them into the ponds themselves. And so by doing that, you gain merit. They also will sell, bird cages of birds, and you buy a bird and release it, so you gain merit. It kind of begs the question is, if you didn't buy those things, people wouldn't be putting them in captivity in the first place. So, but yeah, that's a lot of the trade in trachemes is for these merit releases, and you'll see them. People do keep them as pets, and there is a big import, but I've never found an established reproducing wild population.
Interesting. And some of the other species, the pagodas are interesting because they've got sort of, when you've got people going out into the wilderness and collecting turtles and then releasing them in the ponds. I mean, I think of like the black soft shells, Nielsonian nigricans further west. It seems like that species was, I think, first rediscovered in pagodas and then subsequently found in the wild. But examples like that, right? You'll get species that we don't even think that they're still around sort of in situ, but then you find them in these ponds and can kind of work with that. But I guess when it comes to just other species, what sort of species are you finding in the pagoda ponds in Myanmar? And like, I think of like eyed turtles, right? That's something that the Morania.
Yeah, that's, Trachemes and Morania, I think, are the two common species. Sometimes you'll see soft shells. Some of the early Badagear trivitata that went into the captive breeding programs were actually found in pagoda ponds. And there's a Badagear basca. The only surviving Badagear basca that we know about in Myanmar is in a pagoda pond in Yangon. We've not been able to get it, out of some pagodas will work with you. They're governed by a board of trustees. And some board of trustees, in Mandalay, luckily, we were able to get the Badagear trivitata. They tend to work with us. But the one in Yangon, they won't. They were, pretty much adamant they won't give up that turtle. We were going to move it to another pagoda where we had actually, there's a big pond there, an outdoor grass pond. The monk that runs the place, he's, very progressive and interested in conservation. And we were trying to bring in a male. As far as we can tell, it's a female. And we were trying to bring in a male from Bangladesh or India and start breeding, but we haven't had any luck getting that turtle. And we know that turtle's been there probably since at least the 1960s. And actually, I'll take that back. I believe there's one more Badagear basca in another pagoda pond. I've never been there in Mon State in eastern Burma. So if we can, I think that one is also a female. I know there were two there. One of them died. But I think there's still one there. So we've either got definitely one, I think two Badagear basca that survive in pagoda ponds in Myanmar.
What's the status of the northern river terrapins in Myanmar? You said that do we know if there are any in the wild, or like when was the last time they were documented?
I know my wife found some in early 2000. I want to say it was 2004. It was down in southern Myanmar in a war zone. And actually, these conflict areas where it was too dangerous for people to go in there and go fishing. And we went back, she GPSed the beach where they were nesting. And we went back in 2012 and the beach was gone. There had been a ceasefire declared in the interim. And once the ceasefire was declared, people started fishing in those areas, and they sold the sand to a company, which is Singapore buys a lot of sand. And the only thing we could figure is that the Singaporeans, sucked up all that sand and destroyed the beach. We found the location, but there was no beach there anymore. So that was the last. And those may have not actually been basca. They were far south. We don't really know where Badagear basca, where the dividing line was between Badagear basca and Badagear affinis. So those could have very well been Badagear affinis. We just don't know. At the time that she found them, they were all considered Badagear basca. They hadn't been split. But I don't think she found the eggs. I don't think she saw any living turtles. But that was the last group of wild Badagear that we're aware of. Every now and then we hear some tantalizing story in a coastal area, but when we attempt to follow up, we just not able to find anything.
Right. The paper by, I think, Praschak that split them, they didn't have any sequences from that area because you couldn't. So yeah, that's an interesting point. You don't even know what species is there. I didn't even consider that. Huh? That's pretty interesting. How about some of the other species, like some of the cyclames, also some of the box turtles, right? You've got kind of an interesting box turtle situation there with an endemic variety.
Yeah, I think that variety has been elevated to a full species. They certainly look different. We haven't done much of anything, with those. They're definitely some of them are in the trade, but we other than some records we've gotten from villagers, we really haven't done anything with any of those species. The cyclames aren't in demand really. People eat them locally, but they are, they're, I don't want to say they're easy to find, but you can find them. Where we have up on the upper Chinuan River, I frequently have found them, or village kids have brought them to me. And they found them right around the village in a wetland there. So people will eat them if they get them, but they don't go out of their way to hunt them. So they're probably fairly safe in remote areas right now.
Right. That's interesting. So I guess we can sort of maybe transition to some of the species that you've, I guess, focused on more thoroughly with WCS, and the species that are obviously critically endangered, and we need to establish sort of a baseline. I guess you've done a lot of really interesting adventures. I imagine a lot of stuff that's been kind of scary at times, but at other times really rewarding, right? Maybe you can just, what was sort of the most interesting adventure you've been on in terms of looking for turtles, and kind of why was that the case?
It's hard to say. I mean, I love going into the field. I kind of, measure the I don't know really how to put this, but when you're when you get a lot of field notes, you've had an interesting day. And so, normally you go into the field and I've got, 2 or 3 notebook pages, and I write really small, just filled up with observations. So yeah, every time you go into the field and you get field notes, you're having a good day, you're learning something. But probably the most interesting trip I took, there were actually 2 of them, into the Naga Hills in western Myanmar. And those areas, we had, the first trip we took, we kind of probed around the periphery, and we had to get permission from an ethnic army to go into the Naga Hills, and they just wanted to make sure. I've never felt threatened by any insurgent group in Myanmar, and there have been these ethnic armed organizations all over the country for years, and their beef is not with foreigners. But we went into the area in the Chin Hills and the Naga Hills that were controlled by the Naga, and we didn't really. Well, we got some interesting turtle records out of there simply because nobody had ever been in there looking, or hadn't looked for years. But it was really fascinating because most of those people had never seen a foreigner. I was the first foreigner that they ever saw, and so you'd walk. Each of these villages were about a day's walk apart, and so we pretty much just walked from village to village and talking to people and asking if they had any turtle shells around, and what other kind of wildlife was in the area. But most of those people had never seen a foreigner, so you have to get used to being stared at, because everybody would just gather around you and stare at you. But I remember one time in this one village, I kind of got used to being the only foreigner that had ever been there. And I just remember one time I asked him, I said, I'm like the first foreigner who's ever been here, right? And they looked at me and said, oh, no, you're not the first foreigner. Foreigners have been here before. And I was like, wow, this is, I wonder who else has been here. And so I asked him, I said, well, what other foreigner has been here? And they said, well, that would have been Father Diekman. I said, what year did he come through here? And they, well, I think that was 1932. And, so it had been years, and they had his name carved on a rock. And he was, best as I can determine, he was an Anglican missionary that had walked from India because Nagaland overlaps the border. The international boundary goes right through it. And he had walked from India, him and an Indian Anglican, missionary. He had both walked into Nagaland and visited that village in, I think, 1932 or 1933. So yeah, officially, I wasn't the first foreigner that they had ever seen. But that happened the first time we went into Western Myanmar, into the Rakhine, into the Arakan Yomas, looking for turtle, or the Arakan forest turtle, Hyosemes depressa. That was 1999, and this old man came into our village, and we got to talking to him, and he had walked for, a couple of days just because he had heard that there was a foreigner staying in this village, and he wanted to look at me. And so I asked him, I said, when was the last time you had ever seen a foreigner? And he said, the last foreigner I saw were Japanese soldiers in the Second World War that made me, conscripted us all and made us build this trail that you came in on. And so he was pretty old. I don't know how old the guy was. He was probably in his late 80s at the time, but he said he felt really bad. And, he didn't know what year he had been born in. But he felt bad and had just described all these ailments that he had. I mean, the guy was ancient, he's got to have some, he's lucky to be alive in the first place. So he wanted me to give him medicine. And so I didn't have any medicine to give him. I don't think there's any medicine you could have given him for these things. So I had all these multivitamins with me, and I just gave him the whole bottle. And I said, take these. This is really powerful stuff. I said, if you take more than one a day, you're going to die. So only take one of them a day, and you'll be okay. And so I didn't think anything of it. The guy left. And so we made a big circuit through there. And a couple of weeks later, we came back to that village. And man, that guy showed up, and he brought us all these chickens and bamboo tubes full of sticky rice. And he was telling us how he felt, he felt like he was 25 years old again because of that medicine I had given him. So, I mean, he could have had a vitamin deficiency, but I really think it was just the placebo effect. I had given him some power.
That's how powerful the placebo effect can be.
Yeah, he was expecting to get better, but we had a big feast, and he was so happy. And it made me feel really good that I helped this old guy out. And we talked to him for a long time, and he told us how it used to be and living in that, because that still is a pretty remote area, of Burma. So it was kind of a fascinating talk, and I felt like I'd made the guy, made his life a little bit better.
That's interesting.
I was gonna say, we're gonna show up there at some point. We're just gonna see your name carved on a rock somewhere.
Yeah. I always wonder if in that village I'm not, my name's not carved underneath Father Diekman. So you see that all the time. I mean, even in, you don't get it in Yangon or Mandalay because people are a bit more sophisticated and they've seen foreigners. But I've been out, working in some of these Star Tortoise sites and just have people stop and want to take their picture with me. And I remember one time in Schwiesata, it's kind of some rough areas. I found human remains not too far from the sanctuary headquarters. The guy looked like somebody stuck an axe in his face. It was just a skull and some long bones there on the trail. But the sanctuary warden told me not to go wander off by myself. It's not safe. And so I was kind of like, I wasn't too far from it. I was walking down the road near the headquarters one evening right before dark, and these two motorcycles with about 5 guys on them, riding 2 motorcycles passed me up. They looked at me and they went down the road and turned around. Both of them turned around and started coming back real slow. I was starting to get worried at that point. I didn't know what to expect, and I'm kind of looking, I'm used to run a lot, so I figured maybe I could outrun these guys if I had to. And they started getting off their motorcycles. All they wanted was to have a picture taken with a foreigner. And so I stood there while these guys took turns with their cell phone, each getting in a photograph with the foreigner. They had no idea. I don't speak much Burmese, but they just wanted to have their picture taken with me. And that's happened. That was kind of early on, but that's happened to me, countless times in remote areas where people just want their picture taken with the foreigner because I'm some kind of a, you're kind of a novel experience for them.
That's very interesting. I guess that's one of those things that you wouldn't necessarily realize when you're doing field work, that would be something that you're going to experience, right?
Yeah. It's, I never expected it. And, people, you go into a village and everybody stares at you. I remember years ago, I don't mean to get off on all these stories because they're completely unrelated to turtles, but I just remember I was in this area where we do a lot of work now. This was in 1999 when we first went to go look for star tortoises in Schwiesata Wildlife Sanctuary. And I was sitting in this chair and we were talking to the village head man. And back in those days, they used to get, they would have a generator and they would run a VCR and they would watch Western movies, action movies, you know. And I just remember like these women were all sitting around me talking, you know, it was obvious they were talking about me. And so I asked, you know, this woman I was with who, you know, is now my wife. I asked her, I said, you know, what are these people talking about? What are these ladies talking about? They're obviously talking about me. And she listened for a while and she said, they all agree that you look exactly like Jean-Claude Van Damme. So, you know, they had been watching Van Damme movies. And I guess we all just look alike to them, you know. And so, yeah, first foreigner they had ever seen, he obviously looks like Jean-Claude Van Damme. So I didn't know if I should take that as a compliment or not.
That's funny.
To them, it's like finding a lifer, seeing a foreigner.
Yeah, exactly. You know, that village at that time, that was probably the only foreigner. I know I was the only foreigner that they had ever seen. Hey, at that time, Myanmar was closed off, so there were very few foreigners outside of the, you know, the major cities. Even in the major cities, you'd have, you know, if you saw a foreigner, I mean, I would go, or they would come up to me and ask me what I was doing there, just because it was so unusual.
That's cool. So you mentioned the Chinuan River. That's an area I think that's pretty kind of focal to a lot of the work that you're doing, specifically with the Burmese roof turtles. Maybe so. I've followed that work kind of throughout the years through the TSA magazine, although I haven't seen one since 2019. That could just be because I haven't gotten the most recent updates or whatever, but I don't know what that was. But I'm curious, in the past few years, what that program has been like. Maybe you could give us sort of a rundown of kind of how that's worked. I mean, you guys have done some really incredible work there, bolstering the assurance colonies, but maybe you can just talk to that and how the past few years have been in terms of production of offspring.
Well, they're doing pretty good in captivity. In fact, it was really coincidental. Tonight, I got a text message from one of our people in Myanmar, and 37 out of 37 eggs hatched on the Chinuan. Those were wild collected eggs. Wow. And so if you've been following, so that was really good news because I don't think any hatched out last year. We're down to a very small number of animals. We think, you know, less than, you know, I think this year 2 females nested on the Chinuan. I can't go. I haven't been to the Chinuan. I left because of COVID in 2020, and I haven't been able to get back in since then. I can't do any field work, but luckily we have, you know, Burmese staff that are able to still run the project. The work we do in the wild, and those are important turtles genetically. But those are the surviving, you know, wild population of turtles. Every year we monitor the beaches, the sandbanks where they nest, and we collect the eggs and bring them back to our base camp and incubate them there. But it's touch and go. You know, it's you know, we get them. One year we lost at least 1 female. So we're down to 2 females that are nesting, an unknown number of males. I think in 2014, we ended up with 0. 2014 and 15, we had no eggs hatch out. They were just, all non-viable. We think we had 1 or 2 males and we lost them. So the following year, we released males and we started getting viable eggs again. So it's, you know, it's hit or miss, but we're getting a lot of them in captivity. I think last year we got right around 300 of them hatched out in captivity. And what was really exciting about last year, because we've got assurance colonies, we've got one at the Mandalay Zoo, another one at Alakananda Wildlife Sanctuary, which is near Bagan. We've got another one at Tamanthi, and we've got one at the Yangon Zoo. Both of the last 2 at Tamanthi and the Yangon Zoo are pretty new. We haven't really gotten any fertile eggs out of either of them. We haven't gotten any eggs out of either of them. But for years they've been breeding at the Mandalay Zoo, and we were getting around 150 to 175 hatchlings. And then last year they started nesting at Alakananda Wildlife Sanctuary. And what's exciting about that is that those turtles, the ones at Mandalay Zoo, are wild caught, or we got them out of Pagoda ponds. But the ones at the Alakananda were actually animals that we hatched out in captivity and reared in captivity. And we had no idea, you know, if those animals would even breed or when they would start breeding. And we were thinking maybe, based on some work that was done with Vandyke finnis, maybe it would be 20 to 25 years, before they started breeding. So, I mean, we started these work when I was 50 or roughly 50 years old. I was afraid, I'm going to have to wait, 75 years old to see these turtles breed. Well, they started breeding at a lot younger age. We're not sure which females nested, and we have various aged females, several age groups of females in that pond. But the oldest females in that pond were only, I think, 14 or 15 years old, and so they started producing eggs at a much younger age than we thought they would. And they've also I think last year we got 30. I think we got 42. And 6 of them we found the hatchlings in the eggs dead, but we still got, a good 36 hatchlings. This year we've had about 30 hatchlings. It's very early in the season, so we're expecting to get more. So they nested a second time. And we also, we've also from the Mandalay Zoo, we've gotten around 20 of them. So they're just getting started there now. So, it's shaping up to be another good year of captive breeding. So Vandyke trivittata is secure, in captivity. I think we've got them when we've gotten the breeding, and we're breeding good numbers of them. But in the wild, it's still it's still like I always used to say, quote the Duke of Wellington after the Battle of Waterloo. It's a damn close run thing. Because it's still hit or miss with them in the wild. And it's always easier to preserve, an animal in the wild than it is to reintroduce it. So we've done some reintroductions. The turtles haven't started to breed yet. We're not sure, we can only track them for about 2 years before the transmitters go out. The last day that I was on the Chinuan, we had a fisherman bring us. Last day I was there, a fisherman brought a turtle from 2015 that he had captured, and he brought it to us, and said he had caught this turtle, and we were able to. It had microchip. Transmitter had fallen off. We microchipped it. It was one. We read the microchip. It was one we released in 2015. So they're still in the river. But when those animals are going to start to breed, or if they'll start to breed, we just. It could be a number of years from now. But it's much easier to keep them in the wild in the first place than it is to have them extirpated and then reintroduce them.
Right. I think the ultimate goal, it's incredible that the Head Start, the Shrins colony, the Head Starts have started to breed already in the wild. That's really exciting. I think the ultimate goal of any conservation project that's looking at repatriation. So I'm curious how far they move, because I know that there's some documentation. You actually sort of worked on like rediscovering the species, I think, and then I guess maybe what was that process like, and then how far are they moving? Because there's not a lot of documentation of them anywhere else in the Irrawaddy.
Yeah, we don't know how far they move. The ones we put transmitters on and track, they don't go very far. They seem to stay right around within about a 10-kilometer stretch of river. But we don't know if they were if they were naturally would migrate up and down the river, or move down the river and come back to nest on certain sandbanks. We just don't. All of it's just a big blank right now. So yeah, I was involved in the rediscovery myself, and I've rediscovered them in the Dokthawadi River, and that population unfortunately has since gone extinct. A few years after we found them there, they built a hydropower dam, which flooded the only known nesting site, and then there was a big influx of fishermen into that area. But what happened was that I went there, when was it? In December, I went to Mandalay, and this river's not far from Mandalay. And so after I had to give a presentation at the university there, and afterwards we went along the river and we talked to a few people, and they kept talking about these large, these turtles that laid eggs that were the size of duck eggs. And I was like, there's only one thing that's going to be, and it's got to be, Vandyke trivittata. And so we came back that dry season And that was a neat place too, because we also found star tortoises that were just like dirt common there, Burmese star tortoises, because they had these religious beliefs that they just didn't bother to protect the police protected the tortoises. But we went up the river and we went to this village, and this guy, this guy was a con man. We couldn't get a straight answer out of him, but he gave us a shell of a Bataguer trivittata that had recently been collected. I mean, the flesh from the inside of the shell was still hadn't even dried completely. But we didn't know where. He wouldn't tell us. He kept, every time we talked to him, he changed the story. The police were looking for him for something. But anyway, that confirmed that they still survived. And then a few months later, I went back to the States. That's when I decided to go into academics. I tried to go up the Chinuan River, but we couldn't get permission. And then Gerald Kuchling was able to get permission, and he went up the Chinuan River to where the specimens that were collected that are in the Natural History Museum in New York were collected. And he found that they were still surviving in that area. But that was in I think I found it in 2000. I don't even know when that was, 2001. And Gerald found them in 2002, I think the following year, 2003. But since then, over the years, their range has just shrunk. They were a southern sandbank and an upstream sandbank, and now they're down to one sandbank where we know they still nest. And so they're not making a recovery in the river, or it's nothing we can demonstrate. Although we put a number of turtles into the river, and they probably are still there. But it's just recovering them in the river is going to take us a long time, especially given the political situation in Myanmar now, where we just can't get out and do the field work that we need to do.
What kind of, I think that with like conservation programs, a lot of times you want to bring in genomics or genetics work when you're doing Head Start, specifically with species that are kind of low numbers in the wild. Have you sort of characterized maybe like an estimate of like effective population size in the wild, or do we have an idea of that?
Yeah, effective population size based on some work that a graduate student from Singapore did is about 10. I think it's actually much smaller than that, because the animals are so related that it's very difficult to genetically distinguish them apart. So there's these lineages that are full sib lineages. You have brothers and sisters that are mating with each other. And so far, we are lucky. We haven't seen anything that we can say is inbreeding depression yet. And so, sometimes if the collapse is sudden, but then the recovery is sudden, you can avoid those those deleterious effects of inbreeding depression. And so, there's not much we can do about it, just because we have so few turtles in the first place. And so hopefully we can avoid all that, but we have to work with the hand that we were dealt.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's an interesting program, and pretty incredible that you've not only played a part in sort of rediscovering them, but also in bringing it back to the point where there are now, in captivity at this point, is it over 1,000?
Yeah, I just worked up the numbers a couple of nights ago. I think it was 1,172 left that we have in captivity. But just within the numbers are starting to, they're hatching out right now. And so far, I think we've had about 50 of them hatch out. So you can add 50 to that number as well. So they're secure in captivity. I wish we had some breeding. We have a breeding group in Singapore, but they've never reproduced in captivity. And I think it's because they're on the equator. This is not an equatorial species. The upper Chinuan River is temperate. You go there in the wintertime, the water temperature is too cold to take a bath, at least for me. And, you're walking around with a sweatshirt on in the daytime, and they just don't seem to do basically there's no difference in photo period in Singapore. And I think that messes them up. They're active, reproductively active. Males are in breeding coloration all year round. Anyway, that colony in Singapore is not reproducing. Everything we've got right now is in Myanmar. I really wish we had other colonies, in the U.S. Or some other, country where we could actually just have some insurance that nothing's going to happen to those, colonies. You don't want to have all of your eggs in one basket, so to speak.
Right. That's pretty interesting. The U.S., is that something that's feasible, or is that kind of just a long-term?
No, I don't think right at the moment we could get them out, but I think they would do great, at the Turtle Survival Center in South Carolina. You have to bring them in for part of the winter, but I think the rest of the year would be, very similar to, to their native habitat. I think the Chinuan, I want to say, is about 17 degrees north latitude. I'd have to double check that, but it's nowhere near, it's nothing like being on the equator.
Yes, actually, one of our. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I'm the delay.
You could probably. It would definitely work over here in certain parts of the country because there's actually a change in the temperature throughout the year that it's not static. If you're going to be right on the equator, it's just warm the whole year. So I could see them breeding in the Turtle Survival Center or some other facility here.
Yeah, I think it's temperature and also day length as well. Because you're on the equator, you don't have any change in either of those. It basically is constant. Singapore's constant all year round. So yeah, I'd love to get a group at Turtle Survival Center or someplace in Florida. I think they would breed quite easily.
Yeah, that makes it tricky though. I mean, that you can't really control. It's really difficult to artificially replicate any of those conditions. So you have to work with geography, and there you can't. I mean, I couldn't see it working in like a greenhouse type situation unless you were to artificially control the amount of light that was coming in and work with the temperature at the same time. And that might not even be worth it resource wise if you were to just take advantage of an area that naturally has the proper conditions.
Yeah, I mean, it's, by far, I think you could put them in outdoor ponds in South Carolina and just bring them in the cold part of the winter, put them back out in the early spring. They do fine. But, the problem is getting them out of Myanmar, even in the best of times, that would be challenging. But right now it's a non-starter.
Right. The same thing with when I spent some time in Madagascar, they told me a lot about how it would be preferable to get a lot of the tortoises and the confiscation. Some of them set them up in the U.S., but it's very challenging in Madagascar. And I imagine that's got to be the major obstacle there is just regulation at the national level. But that would be something interesting to see. One of the fourth co-host is actually driving to the Turtle Survival Center today. That's why he couldn't make it, because he just got an internship spot for a few months. So kind of an interesting side note, I guess. So the Star Tortoises is another project that you've worked on that I mean, just in the statistics I've seen, it seems like that might be maybe unarguably the most successful kind of ground up repatriation and captive assurance colony conservation program. But maybe you could give us an update on the past few years with that and sort of what's the most recent things that have been happening with that.
Yeah, we're kind of in a holding pattern right now just because of the political situation there. But we've we started with 175 animals. And, I should say, back up, kind of talk about the roof turtle. The star tortoise were in captivity. They were in the pet trade. And so, they went extinct in the wild. We had animals that we had confiscated from traffickers, or the forest department did, and those were the founders. I'm not sure, the best we can figure between 175 and 200 tortoises. But even if we wouldn't have gotten those, we still could have gotten that species out of the pet trade. And, we would have been working with smaller numbers, and it would have been more difficult and taken longer. But it wasn't hopeless. But the roof turtle, if we had not have intervened when we did, that species, I have no doubt in my mind that they would be extinct by now, simply because there were a handful of animals in captivity. Well, I know that one got into the United States, is in the hands of a private collector, but they were not in the pet trade, so we had no source of animals to start assurance colonies. And we really got lucky there. But the star tortoise, we started that. The first few years, we really, we didn't have good facility. Things weren't going, didn't go too good. We would get, I don't remember numbers offhand, but we'd get, 20 or 30 hatchlings. And then when my wife and I don't want to, she won't, she won't take credit for this, but she went back and kind of galvanized everybody. She went back in 2011. We both started. She went back about 6 months before I did, because had to finish up the semester. She went back and kind of got things organized. And if you look at the numbers, they kind of piddle along for about 5 or 6 years. Not much happens. 2011, they go into what turned out to be an exponential growth curve. We're getting, every year we get, 1,000 to 3,000 hatchling star tortoises are born. We're really to the point now where, we need to stop breeding star tortoises, because we're breeding them faster than we can get them back into the wild. It's more like, it's not even like, it's almost like you're working with a commercial poultry farm, when you start dealing with these numbers and you're trying to figure out, how many to dose with antibiotics and how much food to give them. It's just, the numbers are staggering. I mean, it's a good situation to be in, as opposed to the other extreme where you're struggling to get any offspring at all. But we're breeding them, just gangbusters, basically. And so and it doesn't take, we can get them to reproductive size in 5 to 6 years. And so those are the size of the animals that we're translocating and getting them out into the wild. But the only thing is that they're so valuable that people, I mean, we talk about organized criminal gangs. We've had break-ins at our captive breeding facilities, break-ins at our holding pens. I had to deal with corrupt government officials. It's just, and these animals they're going, we've tracked some of them that have been stolen. They end up we've recovered them from China, from Thailand, Vietnam, and some of them have turned up in Canada. So, I mean, this is a global network of traffickers that are moving these tortoises. People are willing to pay big money for them. I always wonder if and it's debatable, and some people, I go to a TSA meeting and we'll start, this question comes up all the time, and it really turns into a heated debate. But it seems to me, if we could sell a lot of these tortoises and flood the market with these hatchling tortoises and drive down the price low enough, it may not be worthwhile for people to go into the wild, take the risk to steal them. But it just seems like basic supply and demand. But I'm told that the economic principles don't apply to illegal wildlife trafficking. I don't know whether that's, I'm not, I can't really judge that. I'm not competent enough I don't know enough about economics to know if that's true or not. But as long as the price is, of star tortoises is high, people will be willing to break into those assurance colonies. And that's where they're most vulnerable, when they're in those pens, because they're concentrated. You can grab a lot of them in a short amount of time and run. So, I mean, our assurance colonies where we raise these star tortoises, they look like, maximum security prisons in the U.S. They're, high fences topped with concertina wire. We have people that live inside them. In these huts, they're not there all the time. They rotate out, but we have staff that are inside the pens, 24 hours a day just to prevent theft. It's like, you hear rhino conservation where they have armed guards that follow these rhino around just because they're so, it's such a risk for poaching. That's what we have to do with the star tortoises to keep people from stealing them.
Yeah, I think one interesting thing about where these turtles are headed to. I think, if I understand correctly, most of these turtles were demanded from China, and then until some point, the other international markets were actually accounting for more of those demand. Is that what do you think are the factors behind that change?
Yeah, the star tortoises are popular, I think, all over the world. I think just the way these trafficking networks go, they go to China first, and then they go elsewhere. But Thailand, the first big death case we had, all the tortoises went into Thailand. We actually recovered them from. We found a guy in Thailand was posting them on Facebook. In fact, it was interesting because they disappeared. It took us a while to figure out that they were how they were stolen from the pen. I contacted somebody right before lunch. I contacted somebody in Bangkok, and I said, hey, these star tortoises are missing. We think they might have been moved into Thailand. Have you heard about any star tortoises? I came back from lunch and I had that guy's screenshot of this guy's Facebook page where he had some. We could identify the tortoises because they were marked. And so we went to Thailand. We ran our own investigation. We shouldn't have. We don't know anything about law enforcement. I mean, everything I know about law enforcement, I got by watching Law and Order series on TV, and so this was an amateurish effort, but we figured out who the traders were, the people who we figured out who stole them. Pretty much everybody that was involved on the Myanmar side was arrested and went to jail for about a year, except for one guy who was a ranger. Who was overseeing the reintroduction, and he was letting the people in to steal the tortoises. And we never got him. He was slippery, but the people in that area believe those tortoises, if you harm them, they're protected by these spirits, these earth spirits. They call them gnats. And if you harm the tortoise, something bad will happen to you. And don't you know that guy ended up dying a short time later? And so it's basically, everybody said, well, we told you that was going to happen. It was basically divine payback. But then we went to Thailand, and the Thai National Park Police had a file on this guy. They had been investigating him. And so we looked at a bunch of surveillance photographs, and they needed to get a warrant. I don't know anything about Thai law, but apparently it's easier to get a warrant there than it is in the U.S. So they matched up the trees in his Facebook post with some of the surveillance photographs that they had. And they asked me if I'd be willing to come back on, within a couple of days. And because, somebody was going to have to file a complaint against this guy. And so I said, yeah. And I didn't think anything was going to happen. And sure enough, they called me right before Christmas to come fly to northeastern Thailand. They had arrested this guy and gotten these tortoises. Now, he had filed off the tattoos on the carapace. When I took a microchip reader with me, and when I got to northeastern Thailand, it took me a day to get there. They produced these tortoises, and I, zapped them with the microchip reader. Bing, bing, bing. They were all ones we had released, but nobody had noticed that the scutes had been cut. And I had a master sheet with me, and the ones, and there was a perfect match, not only with the microchips, but with the scutes, it had been clipped. Okay, so I had to file a complaint. Those tortoises didn't belong to me. They belonged to the Myanmar government. And so the Myanmar government deputized me to act on their behalf, which was almost unheard of for them. They've never done that for a foreigner before. So I went on Christmas Eve and swore out a complaint against this guy who was sitting in the next, room. And it was all in Thai. The Thais basically told me what to say, translated it. This guy ended up in jail. He had sold them. He had gotten them from another guy in Bangkok, an animal dealer, and the police then raided his place, and he didn't have any more star tortoises, but he had an illegal orangutan. So he went to jail. So we did take down a couple of players there. But most of the tortoises we didn't recover, and those probably went into China or elsewhere in Thailand, or back into the U.S. I think it's a global network. But any of those animals, they're all microchipped, and so if they turn up, we kind of have a standing deal with the Fish and Wildlife Service. If any of them turn up here in the United States, they microchip, put a microchip reader on them, we could still make a case against those people.
Right. That's interesting. I think so. Yeah, that I guess the marking serves sort of two purposes, right? Kind of reinforcing those tribal beliefs there, but also once they're in the market, you can even kind of track them down. That's, I guess, good. It's controversial, but I think that when it comes to conservation, it's definitely worth it. We're sort of getting.
If I can just say one thing about that we had hoped that defacing would lower the value of the animals, but it doesn't seem to be. I don't know how many people in the wild have found one and then left it alone because of the religious icons that we put on there. But to get them off, you have to sand the carapace. And so when you do that, that's obvious. We can look at a photograph. So we found some in China. They had sanded them all those markings off, but the sandings were, and we just said, well, microchip them, and they did and sent us the numbers, and we said, yeah, those are some of ours. So it does help trace the animals.
Yes, that's definitely a good thing, and teaches you a lot more about the tortoises, also about the trade routes, I imagine, and everything. So we're starting to kind of come up on time. We try to, obviously we could talk forever, but we try to keep it sort of to a reasonable management for people that are listening. But I've got just one quick question too about the soft release and how effective that has been with the star tortoises.
Yeah, it seems to be effective. They tend to stay right around. We still haven't looked at all that data yet. We've got reams and reams of data, but they tend to stay within a kilometer or two of where we release them. Some of them don't. Those pens enclose natural habitat, and the way we release them, we just bust holes. It's bamboo, so we'll remove some of the panels and just let them find their way out. And some of them never leave. They set up housekeeping, in the pen, and they'll leave and they'll come back and just go back and forth. So it seems to be it seems to dampen that post-release dispersal. We don't, in one wildlife sanctuary we work, it's really important because it's not a large sanctuary, and if they just set off across country, they're going to be out into somebody's bean field before long. And so in the other area, it's not that important because it's a huge protected area. So we don't mind there if they wander too much. But the soft release does seem to be not only our experience, but other people's experience as well. It does seem to work. And, it makes intuitive sense. I mean, if somebody dropped you off in a city you had never been to and, told you to survive, you'd wander around, not know where you were, be completely disoriented. But, you set you up to a hotel and you just kind of, the hotel's your base and you work out from that and you build a mental map of the city. And I think that's the same thing that, those soft release pens do for our tortoises.
Right. That's an interesting thing. So I guess sort of our last concluding kind of question would be, I guess we do a little turtle trivia round at the end here, just a quick little volley for fun, just to bring up stuff that's sort of, as Carl Franklin put it on one of the previous podcasts, to demonstrate all the useless turtle knowledge we all cumulatively have. But just sort of the last question would be, for someone that's interested in getting into turtle and tortoise biology or conservation or just herpetology in general, what would as a career, what would your one piece of advice be?
Don't expect to get rich. That's for sure. But no, I don't know. I kind of came to this. I've made all the wrong moves. I never really planned my career out. It just worked this way. But just if you're interested in turtles, just follow your heart's desire. You're not going to make a lot of money, but you'll have a good time, and it's extremely interesting. So just get as much field experience. Work for people, volunteer if you have to. Get out there and get to know people and get the experience in the field doing stuff. That's probably the best bit of advice I can give somebody. Read a lot. even if you're not a professional if you're interested in turtles and it's not your profession, still, keep up with as much literature as you can, because, we're always learning new stuff, and things are changing all the time. So, definitely, I used to tell my students when I was professorizing to, try to read a scientific paper every day, even if it's peripherally related to what you're doing. Just, read it, because you never know what you're going to learn. Pasteur always said chance favors the prepared mind. So, prepare the mind, read, and get out and get practical experience.
I think that's a great way to sort of to end off the discussion. That's some really great advice, and I think we're all, I guess, pre-college. Yeah, we're all pre-college here. Jason, the other person, he's a sophomore at Kent State, but we're all headed off to college, so definitely we'll take that to heart personally, and hopefully listeners can do that as well. So we do a little sort of turtle trivia here. With a few rounds. We can do this two different ways. If you want to just ask us 3 or 4 questions, we could do that. But we could also do a volley where we kind of ask a few questions, and whatever you want to do.
Well, don't ask me any questions, because it's getting close to my bedtime and I'm fading. But I don't really have any question. What's a good turtle trivia question? I don't know. What's the largest North American species of freshwater turtle?
I'll let Jack do this one. This is probably his favorite question.
The alligator snapping turtles, like macrokellies. Those are the largest. Oh yeah. I got to be specific here. If we're to get really specific, it would be the western species with the largest individuals ever recorded are over 200 pounds, and they were recently caught out of Texas. So,
well, yeah, just to show my age here, I'd forgotten that they had even been broken into 2 species. I learned them as one. So, yeah, that sounds right to me. And I think there was one that was supposedly caught in the upper Mississippi or Ohio River that was larger than 200 pounds, but I don't know if that was ever verified or not.
Yeah, for a while it was anecdotal evidence. I personally found it hard to believe that they would reach more than 200 pounds in the wild, because it was almost, it's rare you'd ever see one over 130 in any area. But I mean, there was one caught last summer in Texas that was 211 pounds. So, I mean, they're out there.
Yeah, those are such cool turtles. Okay, another turtle trivia question. I don't know. We'll talk about, we'll go Myanmar turtles. What's the, this may be too easy since I just got finished talking about it, but what's the, an endemic species of terrestrial turtle, a species of terrestrial turtle that's endemic to Western Myanmar and adjacent areas of Bangladesh?
Well, the Depressa Hyasemis.
That was too easy. We talked. Well,
about I can get the one that we were. I guess maybe not much is on this, but the Burmese black turtle, the Melanocheles turjuga, that one was one that's endemic, but kind of an interesting one that gets overlooked a lot, I guess. But
yeah, I think that's actually a full species myself. Okay. They're real common in India. And so, but I've only seen a few specimens in Myanmar. I think actually that's a full species, especially if you look at the distribution, because you got a mountain range separating India from Myanmar. So yeah, I think that's yeah. They're not in Bangladesh though, but yeah, I think they're that would have been that's a good answer.
Right. One thing I realized too, kind of looking through stuff, is a lot of the species that occur in Myanmar, especially the ones on the top 25, the IUCN list, all have Burmese in the name. So a lot of endemic species and such. Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe if you got a few more questions.
I should have prepared these in advance. I can't think of anything offhand. So.
All right. Well, that's good to go.
It's past my bedtime.
No. I was going to say it's got to be getting pretty late. So that was a is certainly very interesting and really informative. I think I speak for everyone. I definitely learned a lot, and to hear your perspective and some of the adventures and such, really interesting stuff you can't necessarily get out of the magazine overview of the project, right? You add the human aspect to conservation, which is really just an interesting thing. But thank you so much for coming on, Dr. Platt. It's been great to talk to you and hear more about the experiences. Hopefully we'll cross paths at the Turtle Survival Alliance meeting if you end up there.
Yeah, no, thanks for inviting me on, and I wish all of y'all well with your careers. There's not enough turtle biologists in the world, so yeah, we can always use some more. So, definitely, it's a good career path to pursue, especially if you're interested in turtles.
Right. Yes. Okay. Well, it's been great. Just a reminder to everyone. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm starting to.
I was just saying for coming on. I learned a lot during this episode. Those stories were they're very intriguing, entertaining. Makes me want to get on a plane and then fly out there. But that was awesome. Thank you for coming on.
Sure. Never a dull day in this business.
It certainly seems like that, but just a reminder to our listeners, you can find us at theturtleroom.org/CheloniaCast. Also find us on whatever social media we're on. I think Instagram and other things maybe, but it's been great. Really happy to have you on today, and I think just a really interesting discussion. So thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you on the next episode.